Welcome to this video on the second move a3 against the Sicilian defense. This is the so-called Mengarini variation, and the position I would like to discuss arises after the moves e4, c5, a3. The idea of the move a3 is to play b4 and then bring the bishop to b2. Usually b4 is also played as a pawn sacrifice. For example, if black now plays knight c6, white still plays b4 and sacrifices this pawn. After c takes b4, a takes b4, knight takes b4, black has won a pawn. But white can play c3, driving back the knight. After knight c6, he has the option to play d4. Now, as you can see, white has taken control over the center with e4 and d4. He has two half-open files, the half-open B and A file, and the rest of his pieces can be developed easily. Therefore, white has some compensation for the pawn, and I would suggest not to play like that. Instead, after a3, I suggest to play g6 instead. With g6, black intends to bring the bishop to g7, and now white has several moves he can try. He has played a3 on his second move, therefore we should start looking at b4 on his third move. After b4, we play bishop g7. Now the rook on a1 is hanging, and white has to parry that threat. Rook a2 does not make much sense. Therefore, white has to play either c3 or knight c3 to block the attack on the rook. Let's start by looking at c3 first. After c3, white is intending to take on c5 on his next move and then play d4, protecting the pawn on c5 and making it awkward for black to regain it. Therefore, black should play quickly in the center with d5. Now white has two options. He can either take on d5 or he can take on c5. Let's start by looking at taking on c5. If white takes on c5, we of course take on e4. And our idea here is to play knight f6 next and castle short. Then we can play knight d7 and queen c7, attacking the pawn on c5. This means white has to react quickly and, for example, play queen a4 check and win the pawn on e4. Here we play knight d7. The idea is that after queen takes e4, we can play knight takes c5. In this position, we see that black has already developed the bishop and the knight, and we are attacking the queen, which means white has to lose another move, and after that, we can easily develop the rest of our pieces with knight f6 and castle short. This means that black has an advantage in development and he has a small edge in this position. So after knight d7, white instead could try to win a pawn. He could play c6 for example. Of course we have to take that pawn. After b takes c6, white can take on e4 or on c6. Let's start with queen takes e4. White takes on e4, we play knight f6, hitting the queen again. Now if the queen just retreats, we can castle short and we have an edge in development. Therefore, white should probably take on c6. Now the queen is attacking the rook on a8, which means we have to play rook b8. Our next few moves are castling short, playing e5 and also going bishop to b7. Black has basically completed his development, and what has white done in the meantime? He has won a pawn of course, but he has only developed his queen, so the compensation black has should already be close to winning. Which means queen takes e4 is not a problem after b takes c6, and instead we should look at queen takes c6. After queen takes c6, we play a similar concept as before. We play rook b8 and sacrifice the e4 pawn. If white doesn't take the pawn right now, we play knight f6 and protect it. So white has to take it. And we go knight g to f6, developing our other piece. And we will also continue here by playing castle short, e5, and probably bishop to b7. So b takes c5 on the fifth move isn't a problem for black at all, which means white should probably take on d5 instead. After e takes d5, black recaptures on d5, and as you can see, white has a problem with his pawn on d2. It is backwarded, and white would like to play d4 at some point. To accomplish that, he can take on c5 right away. After queen takes c5, he can accomplish this pawn push with d4. And now there are several good squares for the queen. We could, for example, go to a5, or we can go to c7. I suggest we go to a5. We now reach a position where white has the so-called hanging pawns on c3 and d4. Later in the game, white will most likely play a move like c3 to c4. And then the d4 and the c4 pawn give white control over a lot of squares in the center. Also, white will most likely play bishop to d3 and bishop to b2. Combined with c4, the usual pawn break for white is to play d5, and then use his bishops that are placed on b2 and d3 to attack the king side. Here, it is not as easy because black has the very advantageous setup with g6 and bishop g7, which gives black a lot of protection on the king side. Also, the bishop on g7 is very actively placed, and when white plays the move c4, the d4 pawn will become a little bit weak. Black can target this pawn with his minor pieces, for example playing knight c6 or knight h6 to f5. All those cases, black will hit the pawn on d4. Other ideas for black are to take control over the squares d5 and also c4 and occupy them with his minor pieces, for example knight or bishop. Another plan for black is to exchange minor pieces to take away any attacking potential of white and then attack the pawns on, for example, c3. And maybe if white eventually has played the move c4, also the pawn on d4 might be a target. So the hanging pawns are no problem for black, and white might instead, after queen takes d5, play another move which delays a decision on how white wants to execute the move d4. He can play knight f3. Here I suggest we would just play normal developing moves with knight f6, and after bishop e2 we castle short. White does the same, or we go knight at c6. Now eventually white has to decide how he wants to execute the d4 break. He can take on c5, and then we will recapture on c5, and after d4 we go queen a5, reaching the hanging pawns as it was discussed in the previous example. Now white can also play d4 directly. After that, I suggest we take on d4 and force white to play with an isolated queen's pawn. After c takes d4, of course white now intends to play in his next move the knight to c3, which would harass our queen. So in this concrete position, I would suggest we play knight to e4. This is a very good version of an isolated queen's pawn for black, because basically all his pieces can attack the d4 pawn. We can play, for example, rook d8. We can bring our bishop out to f5, and black will have a very easy development, while white has to deal with a weak pawn on d4 for the rest of the game. Now you saw that the fourth move, c3, can be strongly answered with d5, and black gets nice positions. Which means that after bishop g7, white usually does not play c3, but he plays knight c3 instead. Here, white also intends to take on c5 and then play d4, protecting this pawn on c5, which would be a little bit awkward for black to regain it. Since d5 is not possible because white is covering that square, we should play d6 instead, which protects c5. Now, white has several options to develop the rest of his pieces. He can bring the bishop to e2, can bring it to b5, or he can bring it to g2. Also, the knight on g1 can be brought out to f3 or to e2. Let's start by looking at a setup where white plays bishop e2 and knight f3. After knight f3, I suggest we play a setup which includes the moves knight c6, e6, and knight ge7 followed by castle short. The setup allows black, by using the bishop, the knight, and the pawn, to control all the dark squares in the center. After knight f3, white might play d4, so we should start with knight c6. Now, we might take on b4 on the next move, and also the knight on c3 is pinned because of the rook on a1, so white can play rook b1, protecting the pawn on b4 and also getting out of the pin. We continue with e6. White now plays the setup with bishop e2. We play knight g7, of course, and after castle, castle. We reach a position where all the pieces are still on the board. Black can later on continue with moves like b6, bishop to b7, bring probably the queen to d7 and one of the rooks to d8 or c8. And black might think about pushing either d5 or bringing a knight to d4. For white, there is the option to play, for example, something like d3, bishop b2. But usually black should just be absolutely fine in those positions. So bishop e2 and knight f3 can be easily answered with this setup. So let's go back to d6. White might play the bishop to g2, so he could start with g3. We still play knight c6, and we might take the pawn on b4. So white again plays rook b1, and we play b6. The reason for b6 is that a bishop on g2 can be very strong, and I suggest as a rule of thumb, whenever white goes for the fianchetto with g3 and bishop g2, that we ourselves get a fianchetto and play b6 and bishop b7 to oppose that bishop on g2. So bishop g2, bishop b7 are both logical. Now, white has two options for the knight on g1. He can go to f3 or he can go to e2. In order not to block the bishop view on the long diagonal h1, a8, it makes sense for white to play the knight to e2, and also white might play d3 later on, and white obviously does not want that the knight on c3 is hanging, so knight to e2 makes sense. And we just play our standard setup with e6 now. e6, castle short, knight e7. White plays d3 or bishop b2, and we castle short. Again, our future plan is rather simple. We will play the queen to d7. We will bring one of the rooks to d8, either rook f d8 or rook a to d8, and also maybe rook c8. And eventually we will either play d5 or bring the knight to d4. So this was the fifth move, g3. After d6 there's also a little tricky move with bishop to b5 check. Now we could bring our knight to c6, of course, to play our standard setup, but then we would have to evaluate the following position with bishop takes c6 check, bc6, and white takes on c5. Of course, this one might be completely fine. Black has the very nice light square bishop, but he also has these doubled pawns on c5 and c6. But it is not necessary for us to even evaluate this position and give white the chance to take on c6. After bishop b5 check, we can also just simply play bishop to d7. Now we threaten to take on b5, so it makes sense for white to take on d7 himself. Here we have two options. We can take with a queen, or we can take with a knight. As a rule of thumb, we want the knight to go to c6 to control d4. And after knight b takes d7, it would not be easy for the knight to find a good square, so it makes more sense to take on d7 with the queen. And future moves are, of course, knight c6. We will most likely play e6 again, bring the knight to e7, castle short, and play very similar to the previous shown lines. This concludes our analysis of the third move b4, and in the following videos we will look at other ideas white might try after second move g6.